Reverse engineering compliance. These are not words we often see together, but over the last little while, I've come to think they make a lot more sense than we might think, and so I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. Hi, I'm Adam Shostack, and these days I'm best known for my work in threat modeling. I've written a book on the subject, created a card game, Elevation of Privilege, to help people threat model, advise a company, Arius Risk, that builds threat modeling software, and earlier in my career I created the Microsoft threat modeling tool. I'm also on the review board here at Black Hat and helped to create the CVE. Also, this is not something I normally bring up when I talk about my background, but for today it's important. In the late 1990s, I did reverse engineering work where I broke the secure ID card, an early multi-factor authentication token, and I reverse engineered it using GDB, reading assembler dumps. And so when I talk about this, it is from a place where I've done very classical reverse engineering work to find vulns in real systems. So, with that, what I want to share with you today is some thoughts on what reverse engineering is. I want to talk about compliance systems and threat modeling, reverse engineering the PCI standard itself, and then close out with a question that may be near and dear to your heart. Why bother? So let's get going. So, starting out with reverse engineering. When people talk about reverse engineering, often we think about tools like Ghidra, which is awesome and amazing. And reverse engineering is more than just tools. It's a way of thinking. What does this thing do? Why does it work the way that it works? What can I learn about it by engaging with it, opening it up, taking it apart, figuring out what's really there? And all of that leads to the question, how can I change this? How can I change its behavior? Offensively, by writing an exploit, or by making it do things that the author didn't expect. How can I make it present different information to the person that's using it? Or, if I'm a defender, how vulnerable is this thing? What can I learn about it by taking it apart? And so reverse engineering as a way of thinking is tremendously important and powerful. And oftentimes when we think about reverse engineering, we focus in only on the software tools that we use. And I think that's a mistake. It's like treating reverse engineering as if it's just Ghidra is like treating pen testing as if it's just Kali Linux. There's more there, and that more is important. So, reverse engineering is powerful, and the thought processes involved in reverse engineering apply very broadly in our lives, in the work that we do. And today, I want to talk about how to apply that to compliance systems. Okay? Well, what is a compliance system? It's some sort of rule book. It's a set of things that you are required to do. You'll do this, you'll do that. And these are usually imposed by either contract or regulation, where in order to sell a medical device, for example, you have to go through approval from the FDA. That's a regulatory reason to do this. And sometimes, like with PCI, they're imposed by contract. Each is a set of things, a checklist, if you will, that we say we have to do these things. And we in security often respond poorly to the idea of checklist security. And we often ask, why those things? So, behind every powerful rule book, there's a committee that has written it, and that committee has a set of things that they're worried about. And that is a threat model of sorts. And they hide that threat model, and that frustrates me. And whether or not you know it, that probably frustrates you as well. So I'm talking about implicit threat models. And when we talk about threat models, we're usually talking about explicit ones. Threat modeling is a way of thinking about a system. Asking the question, what's your threat model? Means, what are you worried about? And often the answer is very short and simple. I'm worried about insiders. I'm worried about an attacker with root on the system. We can also say something like, let's threat model this, by which we mean go through a process of analysis to understand what can go wrong with a system, what we're going to do about it. Threat models versus threat modeling. A threat model often refers to the documentation that emerges from an activity like this, often documentation that's written by a consultant. And threat modeling can refer to any or all of the above. There's no one single way to threat model any more than there's one single way to develop software. And so, when I say there's an implicit threat model, I'm not saying there's a specific thing which that committee has developed, which they've all agreed upon. I'm saying there's an implicit bit of threat modeling in everyone's mind. So when I talk about threat modeling, I'm going to give you a very quick intro to how I usually talk about threat modeling to enable me to compare and contrast this normal model which I would use to what we have to do to reverse engineer compliance. And so I think about 4 questions. What are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? Did we do a good job? And these four questions form the basis of almost all the work that I do. When I get confused, I come back to these 4 questions. And if you're simply asking these 4 questions about a system that you're working on, you're threat modeling. And we can get a lot more specific and precise. We can use data flow diagrams with specific rules about how they're constructed as the way in which we answer what are we working on. When we get to what can go wrong, we can just ask what could possibly go wrong. But we can also use a system like Stride. Stride is commonly associated with threat modeling, and it's a mnemonic. It's a way to help us structure our thoughts. It stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And these 6 groups of threats prompt us to be systematic in how we look at a system so that we know that we've actually thought through what can go wrong, doing something more than just asking what can go wrong. We can say, how can someone spoof this? How can someone tamper with it? For something like our credit cards, obviously information disclosure is a big threat, as is repudiation, claiming that you're not responsible for a charge, a package that showed up on your porch, or the package never showed up on your porch. And so this structure is something we often bring to threat modeling, but not always. So, having this structure for how we go about threat modeling will be important as I shift gears and talk about reverse engineering PCI. And so, for some context, by PCI, I mean the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard version 3.2.1, which is the current version out there now. These folks have a hard job. The work of producing a standard that applies to the vendors down at a local fair or Amazon or a massive electronic or physical retailer like Target, and having those rules be consistent and applicable is hard work. Having them be clear is hard work. I don't want to pick on the PCI folks in doing this. I'm choosing to use PCI because it's easily available and it's familiar. If I were to pick a self-driving car security standard, most of you would be lost. I'd have to spend most of the most of the talk explaining the standard. And so I'm using PCI not because of any particular characteristic of its technical content. What I'm saying is, I believe, very broadly applicable to compliance standards, and I'm picking one that is familiar with respect to the folks who are working on it, with respect for the folks who are working on it. So what is the standard? The standard is these 6 things. Build and maintain secure network and systems, protect cardholder data, manage vulnerabilities, etc. And these 6 high-level goals translate into 12 standards or 12 elements. And actually, I'm going to stay here for a second. And then there's a lot of sub-elements. And when we go beyond this, PCI is 139 pages. And let's be frank, it's a frequent source of arguments. The security team ends up in arguments with the rest of the business over, why are we doing this? Do I have to do that? We've got something else. We've got other priorities. Why are we doing this? And then the whole business ends up in an argument with the qualified security assessors, the QSAs, the folks who come in to say, are you in compliance with the standard? And so it's my belief that engaging in some reverse engineering work actually helps reduce these conflicts and get us better security with less work. Let's talk about how. So this is a randomly chosen page of PCI. I flipped through the standard. This is what fell open. And so let's look at it. It's 3 columns. First column is the requirement. So we have a requirement, 115, which we'll talk about as an example, is description of groups, roles, and responsibilities for management of network components. And 116 is you have business rule justification and approval for firewall open ports. The middle column is some testing procedures. Make sure that the standards include these descriptions. And then there's a guidance column, which is a little bit of discussion. And so there's 130 odd, well, there's 100 odd pages of this, to be fair. And we need to talk about the whys. Why is important? There's a famous little book called Start From Why. And why motivates people? Why motivates the business to move past the check mark? Nobody wants their business to be insecure, but we end up with this list of things that can be, frankly, pretty tedious. And when we're done with it, we end up having no energy to do other security work. Understanding the why can enable innovation by engineers. Engineering, at its heart, is really about making trade-offs between complex sets of requirements and finding a place where we satisfy all of them, ideally in an elegant and inexpensive way, that the work that we're doing meets those requirements in a way that actually allows us to ship something, sell it to customers, and make some money. And so engineers are focused on that innovation, that balancing act of this will satisfy all of these things. And if we know what those things are to be satisfied, then we may have more flexibility in the way in which we attempt to satisfy them. And in theory, why can inform our conversation with the people assessing our work. We can say, we believe that this meets the goal of the standard for these reasons. And the third column, that guidance column in PCI, can really help us get to that point. So let's do some reverse engineering. Why? So I started looking at this and I started to go right to the threats, right? What threat does this line address? Because the compliance standard is a set of mitigations to those threats. And so I would look at a line like 115, this description of groups, roles, and responsibilities, where's the problem? What's this? This isn't a characteristic of the firewall. What's going on here? What is the reason that this thing works the way it does? And so, I'm gonna be honest, I was really frustrated when I was doing this. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. And we know that this is a phase that we go through as we reverse engineer things. We're pulling something new apart and we're scratching our heads. Why? And so I went back to the 4-question framework and I said, these are my North Stars. And what I realized eventually is that I was not really answering the question, what are we working on? What I realized when I was doing that PCI has 2 distinct system models. It has a model of process, it has a model of technology. It doesn't really seem to have much of a model of people, separate from the process that they're executing. And that's an interesting sort of thing when we talk about people's exhaustion with the process. But 115 turns out to be all about the process, right? We have a description of the groups, roles, and responsibilities that we're looking at. And so I'm going to skip over some of the boring bits. Going through each and every line in PCI takes a lot of time. And in fact, the project for which I was doing this, we determined that we actually had sufficient answers for that project without finishing going through PCI. And so there are some places where my model is not complete. But what I did was I iterated between the controls and the threats and the system models. And I'm going to show you what I did. And I also published this as a white paper to make the work available for anyone who wants to pick it up and play with it. And so PCI's model of technology starts over here. We've got a model, we've got a credit card, and the credit card runs through a point of sale system. That point of sale system, as near as I can tell in the model, only ever runs through wireless connections, through a wireless firewall to a card data environment, which includes processing and storage. That card data environment talks through a separate firewall to an acquiring bank. And an acquirer is a bit of jargon for the bank which acquires the transactions from the merchant and ships them back to the bank, the issuer, who is issuing the cards to consumers. And so we've got a model of how this works here. We also have a model of the process. And on the top half of the model, there's change management. On the bottom half of the model, there's system deployment. So in this model, there's a bunch of interrupt. Things happen and you have to take action based on them to review and whatnot. And there's timers. Regularly review your firewall rule set. There's a review, there's approval, and there's execution. And all of this feeds into tracking. And their model of system deployment is we have some standards which influence your configuration, which influence your deployment. And all of this feeds into those pesky technical systems which realize the way in which the system is actually deployed. And so their model of threats is actually quite interesting. They're very focused on what I think of as a prevent, detect, respond model. And the threats that they are focused on are primarily information disclosure threats, part of STRIDE if we want to think about it, part of the CIA triangle of confidentiality, integrity, availability if we want to think about it that way, and also a different C, compliance. They have compliance threats and management threats that are thought about in the standard. And these are interwoven in a way that in my world is quite unusual. And so picking that out and understanding it was a little tricky. But now that I understand it, I understand the standard better. And so the threats in this model I break out into threats to the process and threats to the technology. And I'm not going to walk through this table line by line, but threats to element C1, those interrupts, are that the firewall rule set goes out of date. And so PCI requirement 1.17 applies to that. There's some timers. For example, there's a threat that old data is not deleted or not deleted securely, which is covered by PCI 3.1 bullet 2. And so we can think about these threats to processes. We can think about threats to the technology. So interestingly, and I said I didn't go through the entire standard, but there's no threats to the credit card itself. The thing in my wallet is, to my understanding, not treated in PCI. It's all about line 7, the storage. Is the authentication data stored? Is the full track data stored? And these are interesting threats, and I was talking about them with a colleague who said, storage is not a threat, information disclosure is a threat. I'm like, yep, that's the way I think about it too. But in the standard, the simple active storage, which enables later accidental disclosure or later disclosure to an attacker, the active storage is the thing they want to prevent. Okay. And so some of these are threats some of these are things that we want to prevent, their information disclosure. And so we can build out a model of what PCI is looking at. And in building out this model, the last 5, says 4, should say 5, the last 5 slides are my reverse engineering analysis. Why do I have to do this? Because the PCI folks don't share them. They may or may not have made this explicit in their internal working activity. If it's explicit, I would like them to share it. If it's not explicit, I would like them to make it explicit and then share it, because I had to do a lot of painful work to figure this out. And in having done this work, I feel that my understanding of PCI is much deeper than it was when I went through those 139 pages with pen in hand, thinking about each and every one of them. And so that work helped me develop an understanding, and I hope that the threat model, the white paper, the last few slides help you understand PCI in a way that help you deal with it. Excuse me. So this brings me to the question of why bother? So the first reason to reverse engineer anything is it's because it's fun. Reverse engineering, the act of investigation, the act of analysis, the discovery, the aha moment, the, oh, look at that right there. That stuff's fun, right? We in the Black Hat community enjoy this work. It's something that gives us a challenge, and in overcoming that challenge, in learning, we take enjoyment from that. And so the first reason to do reverse engineering is the joy of understanding something. The second reason is the profit. If we have a better understanding of a system, you know, that's a lot of the talks here at Black Hat. And in fact, when we're in the program committee meetings, we'll often say, you know, the attacks on this thing are not all that interesting, but boy, this presentation is gonna unlock a lot of presentations over the next couple of years, because they've done a good job of reverse engineering this thing, and they lay out a set of paths that enable further analysis. You don't have to do this because you're going to get a Black Hat talk, and reverse engineering in and of itself may or may not be enough. So I don't want to make any commitment there. Please don't take this as just reverse engineering is going to get you on stage here. But the act of reverse engineering is at the heart of a lot of our talks because it shows gaps in the rules. It exposes places that defenders are ignoring. And that might be a technical gap where you can get a closed comment through that one parser will look at and another one won't. You can find that this thing parses these headers in one way and this one doesn't, and so we can smuggle a request through. We can smuggle this stack smashing or heap overflow through here, and so take advantage of it. And these gaps in the rules, these places that defenders are ignoring, happen up and down the stack. They happen at the bits and bytes level, and they happen all the way up at the procedural and managerial levels. And so, showing these gaps in the rules, reverse engineering for fun and profit, for the fun being the increase in understanding, the profit being how you take advantage of systems or how you defend systems better, are reasons to do this work. I believe in the long run, this can reduce conflict with auditors. Might not do so in the short term, but in the long run, I think it will help. But hey, reverse engineering's goal is to increase our understanding, is to enable us to do new things, and often that puts us in conflict with the auditors. So, I want to encourage you to threat model your systems. Threat modeling acts as a language between teams. Over and over again, when I'm helping companies develop their threat modeling programs, develop their skills, what comes out of it is a conversation between development and operations and SRE and the SOC, where folks are better able to understand the security assumptions, goals, and requirements of a system. And asking these 4 simple questions of what are we working on, what can go wrong, what are we going to do about it, and did we do a good job, enables non-technical folks, management, project managers, enables those less technical folks to participate in a conversation about security, and enables the business to, as it were, engage in a conversation about the business goals. And so these compliance requirements start to make more sense when they are part of a threat model. The requirement to encrypt data at rest, to not store this information. These are ways of addressing the question, what can go wrong? They're answers to the question, what are we going to do about it? And by putting them into that context, we gain a lot of power. So, to those creating standards, to those imposing compliance requirements, it is time to show your threat models. Why should every organization be doing this analysis? We should be demanding that that information be available. It will improve the standards. When their models don't represent your systems, it's easier to see that. And the requirements, the controls are going to get adjusted, they're going to get invalidated. And there's some complexity here. There's some risks in doing this. If we threat model my demand here, then the answer is, what can go wrong if everyone shows their threat models? There's going to be a little more gaming of the standards. I'm not particularly worried about that, not because I don't worry about gaming the standards, but because I am super aware that the standards are already being gamed every day. And so I think that's a problem that we have to deal with already, and it doesn't get that much worse. The cost of assessment is going to ship. We'll need to retrain auditors, we'll need to redo things, but I believe it will be worth it in helping us start from the why, in helping us understand what it is that we are doing, in helping us deliver more security in the systems that we are really shipping. So with that, I want to say thank you. And if you're here at Black Hat Asia, I'm going to take questions live. If you're not, my email address, adam@shostack.org, is right there. You can hit me up there. You can hit me up on LinkedIn. And thank you for your time and attention, and happy to take questions.